Hi, I'm Robbie Bobby. This video is the 6th in a series that examines the laundry list, otherwise known as the 14 traits of an adult child. The topic is trait 6, which reads, "We have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, and it is easier for us to be concerned with others rather than ourselves. This enables us to not look too closely at our own faults, etc." All right, let's break this down. The opening line, "We have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility," says a lot. In fact, I think it stands well on its own, so let's look into it. First, it sounds very much like codependency. If you're not sure about that, attend a few Al-Anon meetings. I guarantee that you'll hear it in the shares. Not that alcoholics can't have this trait or be codependent. It's just not prominent. In my opinion, this trait would be present in a subgroup of alcoholics who are, in fact, both alcoholic and codependent. To better understand this, look at trait 4, which says, "We either became alcoholics, marry them, or both." And who marries alcoholics? Well, typically codependents. It's just that the term codependent hadn't been coined when the traits were written. There are, by the way, other traits that have the familiar ring of codependency, which in my opinion support an overdeveloped sense of responsibility. Trait 7, for example, says that we get guilt feelings for standing up for ourselves. I think this is compatible with an overdeveloped sense of responsibility. If I feel responsible for making another person happy, I'll be more likely to relegate my own needs. Trait 2 says we became approval seekers and lost our identity in the process. This also ties in. I get approval by getting the job done. I get approval by making the other person happy, etc. Trait 12 talks about being terrified of abandonment, and this gets to the bottom of it. At the core of each trait is a fear of abandonment. This is what turns a normal sense of responsibility to an overdeveloped one. By the way, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous describes character defects as normal traits that have been dialed out of their normal and useful range. Responsibility has a fairly wide normal range, but if it's dialed down too low, it becomes a problem. If it's dialed up too high, it's also a problem. In fact, it becomes trait 6. And finally, what exactly do we feel responsible for? I think this covers a wide field and therefore can show up in all areas of life. However, what stands out for me is feeling responsible for another person's feelings. In all of my adult relationships, I felt responsible for making the other person happy. If a girlfriend was upset or depressed, I would assume that I was responsible in two different ways. First, that I was to blame. In other words, that I was the guilty party who caused her to feel bad and therefore was obliged to make things right, to make her feel better. Why would I feel this way? Maybe it has something to do with feeling responsible as a child for not triggering my dad's rage or my mom's depression. Of course, that was not my responsibility as a child or as an adult, but it's important to remember that this behavior began as a defense mechanism or survival trait. And from that perspective, it makes perfect sense. And like all good survival traits, it both triggers and operates automatically from the unconscious mind. This is the nature of survival traits. Also, these childhood defense mechanisms, which are forms of complex PTSD, do not automatically disable when you reach a certain age. Instead, they stay activated and on alert. So when I see my girlfriend's smile start to fade, it sets off internal alarm bells, and I automatically react. Trait 14 says para-alcoholics are reactors rather than actors. The end result is that I become more concerned with the other person's feelings than my own. In fact, I often don't even know my own feelings. After all, trait 10 says We have stuffed our feelings from our traumatic childhoods and have lost the ability to feel or express our feelings because it hurts so much. Denial. This, by the way, is what enables us to not look too closely at our own faults, which is the final line of trait 6. This implies that the focus on the other person allows us to not face our own feelings, or worse, our lack of feelings. That void can be excruciating. The other person, therefore, becomes a necessary distraction. Our inner protectors therefore see this trait as a positive thing. From their perspective, you can replace the word enable, which has a negative connotation, with a synonym that has a positive one, empower. In other words, that our overdeveloped sense of responsibility empowers us to not look too closely at ourselves. That is how our good-intentioned protectors see it. And by the way, you can't fire or get rid of your protectors. They must voluntarily step down from their protector roles so they can become useful allies. This will only happen when the inner child feels safe, when its emotional wounds are healed, when repressed grief and shame from childhood are processed. This is the work we do in ACA recovery. The point of learning the traits is not to suppress them, but to understand what caused them, and to provide ourselves today with the parenting we didn't receive when we were children. By the way, if you don't like the word enable or empower, you can use a more neutral word such as allow. I like this best as it implies a flow and doesn't conjure up a feeling of blame. For this same reason, I don't like the use of the word fault and prefer to swap in the word feelings, as it better reflects what I'm trying to avoid. Therefore, my revised version of trait 6 goes like this. We have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, and it is easier for us to be concerned with others rather than ourselves. This allows us to not look too closely at our own feelings, etc. And that wraps up this video, which was meant to be food for thought. If you got something out of it, please click like and subscribe and forward to a fellow traveler. I'm Robbie Bobby. Thank you for listening, and as always, keep coming back.